Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's event. We are just getting everyone settled. Feel free to use the chat to say hi, introduce yourself. Let us know a word that you have for the City of Vancouver about renting. And we'll get started as soon as everybody's settled. We have a big group joining us today, so we're going to just give everybody a minute or two. As you're getting settled, just take a look around your Zoom screen. You can see, of course, that we're here for Towards a More Equitable Housing System, and to answer the question, is Vancouver a city of renters? This is a partnership event being offered by the City of Vancouver as part of the Planning Vancouver Together series, which is in preparation for the 30-year Vancouver plan. It's also in partnership with 4 different units at Simon Fraser University. And if you take a look around your Zoom screen, I'll just let you know as we're getting settled that we have a live transcript option. We have interpreters of American Sign Language available. So for those of you who want to activate the interpretation, you can do that. I also need to let you know that the event is being recorded. Your images will not be shown, so it will only be the images of the panelists and not the participants. You can use the chat window. Lots of people are using the chat window already to say hi, let us know who they are, where they're coming from, what they think about renting in the City of Vancouver at this time. That's great. We also have a Q&A box that we'll use much more as we get into today's event. And that will be more for actual questions that you'd like to see the panel address. And I'll get into some of the specific functioning of how we're gonna organize our time together in just another moment or two. Carrie, my first rental experience in Vancouver, I moved in 2001 to the Berkeley Tower. Have you ever seen the Berkeley Tower? It's on Davie Street. It's right on English Bay.
That's right. I know it.
In the middle of being demolished right now, sadly.
Yeah, that was the one where a whole bunch of people got displaced, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I remember that. There were protests.
It was one of the city's first point towers.
Wow.
I remember just feeling so lucky at the time to have found that.
Yeah, yeah. I did after I signed on for this, I did a count of all the rentals I've ever lived in, and I got up to 20 between Vancouver and Toronto and Victoria.
Wow.
So, yeah, definitely know what it's like.
It's been a long journey, and what it feels like to be a renter has certainly changed a lot over the past 20 years, I think.
Yes. Yes, not nearly so easy, I would say.
Yeah.
Not in Vancouver.
Our participant list is still climbing steadily, so I'm just going to give it maybe one more minute, and then we won't be able to resist kicking off.
Mm-hmm. We have a lot to cover.
We do. Okay, well, let's start with some of the welcoming, Carrie. So my name is Meg Holden, and I'm the director of the Simon Fraser University Urban Studies program and a professor there. And I am the co-moderator for today's event. So I just wanted to give you a walk around what we're going to do today together. I mentioned briefly, and I'll say it again, that closed captioning is available today through the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, that we are also recording the event and it will be made available afterwards for viewing. Our chat is open. Many people are finding that. That's great. Please feel free to use that as throughout the entire event. We also have the Q&A box. So please use the Q&A when you want us as moderators to take a look at the questions and make sure that those get addressed as time permits. And we have a whole series of technical support here. So if you're having trouble getting settled, if you're having trouble logging on or figuring out how to hear, how to make it work for you, please reach out to one of the 01 Tech Help listings, such as Rachel, that you can find in your participants list. So before going any further, we are joined today by Lawrence Guerin, a fishery guardian with Musqueam. And Lawrence is going to provide us with a territorial welcome to his territory where we are hosting the event today. Lawrence.
Thanks, Meg. Siyam Nasiye, Lawrence Guerin Quanasqueech, Talitsanat Humathquiam. Amit Sep Quathuilam ia Tanash Humathquiamash Tamu, Tshwa Amits Tas Hunt Kaminam Kan. Ait Tanashqualawan Quans Quats Nala. Needsan Kailtum Nasiya Quans Hunt Kaminam Kan, Saso tu Huait Quath Qualawan. Ait Sapka Tashwalap Quathialap. Quath mia tana shwata eat. Ait tathyais to swallow. Setatsum tani to swallow. East setsan ut siatala. Dear friends, welcome to the ancestral territory of the Hunkaminam speaking Musqueam people. I'm happy to see you all. I was asked by my friends to speak to you in our language today to start the day off with good feelings. Thank you all for coming here. And I hope that you all do good work today. I raise my hands to you all and sincerely thank you. Haitsepka.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. I'm slowly getting to be able to recognize some of the words in Hunkaminam, and it's beautiful to hear. Thank you very much for setting us off on that path on this beautiful day.
Thank you.
We are here today to move Vancouver towards a more equitable housing system. This is the second event in the series that SFU Public Square, SFU City Program, SFU Urban Studies, and the Woodward Center for Community Engagement are engaging with the City of Vancouver in order to provide more opportunity for input and more opportunity for transformative thinking around the 30-year Vancouver Plan process. Today's event, we're focusing on an issue that has long been a thorn in Vancouver's promise of a sustainable city. And we could maybe say that our starting point today is that Vancouver has reached the first step of its path to recovery from a kind of addictive state when it comes to unaffordable housing, that we are going to be honest. We're going to start by being honest about the fact that we have a problem. I said that I am co-moderating today's event with Carrie Gold, who will be well known to everybody who pays attention to housing in Vancouver and across Canada as one of our foremost reporters in the country on urban housing issues, particularly in Vancouver. Carrie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I've been a long-term journalist here in Vancouver for more than 20 years. And for the last 13 years, I've been writing about housing issues for the Globe and Mail every week in the Friday section. And yeah, it started out as a real estate beat, and then it turned into much more of a housing and urban issues kind of beat. So yeah, it's been an interesting ride. There's been a lot of change in the city in the last 10 or so years. And yeah, it continues to be interesting. I can't say a day goes by that it's not interesting. It's quite a great housing, like the housing beat is quite a great thing to cover. I used to cover music when I worked at the Vancouver Sun, and I think that housing is actually real estate's always been a sexy topic in this town, and real estate and housing, the conversation just never stops. So yeah.
As raucous, more raucous than the rock and roll scene.
Yeah.
That's the story of Vancouver.
Yeah, we love it. We love our real estate talk and our housing talk.
Yeah. Love it and hate it, I suppose.
Yeah.
But let's go through the actual content for the event today. So we are going to start off our proceedings with a short presentation from Andy Yan, who will introduce in just a moment, to bring us up to speed with the state of rental housing in Vancouver and to make the case to you at the beginning of our dialogue about the fact that Vancouver is and has long been a city of renters, although it may not seem to be built that way when you look around and see how people are living. Then, after we have some polls to get some feedback from you, and I'll tell you another way to give feedback in just a moment, we will have a really exciting panel conversation with Evan Siddall, Barbara Steenbergen, Leilani Farha, Hill Salem, and William Azaroff. And we will introduce each of our fantastic panelists in just a moment. But each of the speakers will have a chance to give you an introductory comment on how to transform cities to being built for and by renters. And then we will have an opportunity for you, the participants, to offer questions as well. And we'll have some polls and even some very special video contributions as well along the way. So just about how you can participate and add your voices to the event. I mentioned the Q&A, and many of you have already found the chat. I did also want to mention something that we're trying called Padlet, and that's outside of Zoom, but there are some instructions on how to find it if you open another browser window. And there is a series of Padlet chat rooms that have been opened, and they're being staffed by SFU students right now to help collect your feedback, to moderate your own comments and discussion throughout this whole event. And those Padlet rooms will be open a half an hour after the event ends too, so that you can be sure to make a comment and let us know what you think and what we've missed. I think I've already covered all of the housekeeping notes that I had. Did you want to just speak briefly to any housekeeping items, Carrie, or any community guideline items?
Yeah, well, there are community guidelines. I'm not sure, we should be seeing them on the screen. There they are. So basically, you know, be respectful, don't be a jerk, everyone comply, and let's have a great event.
Yeah, totally. Okay, thank you. So before we introduce Andy Yan, I think Seth had, oh, has anybody posted the link to the Padlet? It looks like maybe not everybody has seen that. Thank you very much. So you should see a link to those right now in the chat. So let's ask first off, if Seth, if you can launch our first poll. I have a series of poll questions, as we have the good fortune of having hundreds of this topic gathered with us this afternoon. So the first question is, what are the top 3 housing concerns that the City of Vancouver should be trying to address? Take a look at these, please, and we'll give you a minute to scroll down and consider all of these options. Yes, the Jamboard is the same as the Padlet. Padlet is just the name of the open source technology. The top 3 housing concerns. And you can select up to 3. So maybe just 5 more seconds to get your poll answers in, and then we'll take a look at the results. Oh, you don't, I think the panelists cannot see the poll, unfortunately, only the participants. Okay, can we see the results of the poll? Right. So unsurprisingly, homelessness, top concern, but there's substantial concern for each of these issues. A lack of non-market housing as well, people not being able to afford rent.
Yeah.
Less concern about speculation, but that could just be a matter of priorities, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Home ownership's not a big one. Okay.
Thank you very
Interesting.
much. Carrie.
Yeah, so let's introduce Andy Yan. Most people will know Andy Yan because he's pretty much a fixture in the media, and he's director of the city program for SFU. He's also an urban planner by trade. He got his start with Bing Tom, the legendary architect, and he provides analysis on the housing situation and helps us put it into context and makes it understandable. So here's Andy Yan to give us some more data, some more analysis of data.
Thank you so much, Carrie. And hello, everybody. I think I will share my screen here and start the presentation. And so, okay. I hope folks can come and see my screen, that it's showing up. And thank you, Carrie, for the invitation today. And really, I'm here today to kind of give you a perspective from data in terms of what we might know, and a lot of times it's what we might not know about the aspects of being a renter and an owner in the city of Vancouver. I think that a lot of this material that I'm presenting is really, I think, a compendium of the work that has been done by the collection from the CMHC, from the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Thank you, Evan Siddell and your team, as well as Statistics Canada, and the City of Vancouver, who I think collectively, have started a new, if you will, renaissance in terms of ensuring that data is available to the public and to researchers. And so I'm honored to give you a brief kind of synopsis of what some of the aspects of renting in Vancouver and owning in Vancouver is. And so I think I was trying to think about what's the best way of presenting this, you know, whether the various kind of styles. And I think that as much as one can talk about a Socratic style, I decided to do the, if you will, Trebek style, that it's really a methodology that it goes in towards understanding how to kind of present information over a set amount of time, but then also I think understanding that it supposes a series of answers in questions, and then what the data has perhaps told us over time. So I think to get this started, it's going in towards the first answer, which is, what is Vancouver as a city of renters? And I think that based upon the last census, we discovered that Vancouver is a city of renters, that 53% of dwellings, of households, of how you might measure how households are living, that 53% of those living in the city of Vancouver are renters. But I think what's interesting is the fact that this isn't something that is particularly new, but actually the fact that this is something that has occurred for actually over the last 50 years, that since 1971, and there's no evidence that this will change with the new forthcoming census, that since 1971, that the majority of households in Vancouver have actually been renters. And so moving in towards the question of where they are, the answer is, where are the question, if you will, where are the rental neighborhoods in Vancouver? And I think a lot of this goes into what we think of a city, that if the city is what we expect, neighborhoods are what we get. And from that perspective, it's not surprising that we have a particular set of neighborhoods that I think are readily identifiable as renter neighborhoods, that whether it's in the West End or downtown Vancouver to Strathcona to Kitsilano and Mount Pleasant, as well as Fairview Slopes, that we very much have identified, and I think often talked about the role of renters in those neighborhoods. But I think it's also important to recognize how renters are actually found throughout the city, that very much the idea of renters is actually rental as a means of tenure in the various neighborhoods of Vancouver is a reality in all neighborhoods in Vancouver, whether it's the 42% in Hastings Sunrise or the 39% in Killarney, to what's interesting, the 22% of households in Dunbar Southlands, that those are where renters are everywhere. And I think a lot of this is really reflected in the idea that rental occurs over a number of different forms as well as neighborhoods. And I think what are perhaps some of the reasons? And I think that this goes into the question of what are the costs of owning versus renting in Metropolitan Vancouver, and as a extension of this, the City of Vancouver. This is research that's conducted by the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation through their annual rental report. And in that report, it looks at really what are some of the costs of owning versus renting in this case in Metropolitan Vancouver, but then again, it wouldn't change much by looking at in the City of Vancouver. And the story of owning versus renting is the fact that owning is by far more expensive than renting in the City of Vancouver. You'll see really in blue how much the average rent is in Metropolitan Vancouver compared to owning a condo in Metropolitan Vancouver, which is in gray. And in between the blue and the gray bar is the rent for secondary for what's called the secondary market, rental market, which is basically condos for rent. And you see really the stark differences between owning and renting, and then renting condos, as well as, and this is not necessarily adding in the down payment. So I think this puts up the framework of how most probably rental is a view of the future. And I think there are these types of questions through which we will be talking about today, what that future might look like and what it needs. So when we look at what rental looks like, it's really going to the question of what is a rental dwelling in Metropolitan Vancouver. And I think that this really is something that is important to acknowledge and to recognize. And it's the fact that a rental dwelling can be found in a number of forms, that while we've seen the idea of what's called purpose-built rental, that is housing that is built to be rental, that the majority of rental in Metropolitan Vancouver, 62% in specifically, is actually a mixture of condominiums, which is about 20% of that rental stock, but then also a combination of single detached homes, duplexes, as well as laneway homes. So you have to, I think, begin to acknowledge that when we talk about rental, it isn't just one type or one form, but then it's actually expressed over a number of forms in Metropolitan Vancouver, and not surprisingly, in the City of Vancouver. And so when we talk about the importance of supply, I think that when we think about housing policy, it's important to understand demand. And from that perspective of demand, one of the ways of, I think, focusing on that types of demand on housing is really incomes. And so it goes into the next question: what are the incomes of renters and owner households in the City of Vancouver? And I think that this is really, I think, the point through which we understand the sizable differences between renters and owners. We see that when we look at renters, that 50% of renters earn less than $50,000 a year. 50% of renters in the City of Vancouver earn more than $50,000 a year. And that gives you a sense of what the median household income is. And this is how that spread looks like. And you could see in particular how much lower income households are in the rental pool. And I think that this is really the converse to this is really owners. And when we talk about owners, the median household income for owners is about $88,000 a year. That is 50% of the owner households in the city of Vancouver earn more than $80,000 a year, but yet 50% of the population in the city of Vancouver earn less than $88,000 a year. And so this is how that side of the income picture looks like between renters and owners, and the sizable differences in household incomes between those two populations. So when we talk about really this kind of role of supply and demand, what are some of the types of supply that's coming online or is online? And I think that this is really what the next question goes into. Who can afford the housing units that are being approved in the city of Vancouver? And this is data that is from the first quarter of 2017 to the third quarter of 2020. And this is of housing approvals through which the city of Vancouver has been able to organize along income bands. And those income bands are represented on the bottom in terms of those earning shelter rates, minimum wage, living wage, middle income, professional, and high income bands. And I think the city of Vancouver was able to organize the housing approvals that it's passed and to connect them. Now, this is a combination, I believe, of both renters and owners, of really where that house of who can afford what. And what we find is that in this time frame, that 66% of what's been approved in terms of building in the city of Vancouver are really can be afforded by those who make a professional income at its base. That is from effectively $80,000 a year to and up, in terms of where 66% of those of what's being approved to be built can be afforded by. And I think that to kind of give this a kind of on the ground context, you can also, and on the side note, is that it's important to note that 11% of what's been approved to be built is really what can be afforded by those earning a living wage or less. But that to kind of give this a context, what I've done is I've added in the household income profile of the city of Vancouver as of the 2016 census. And this is how that population looks like. And so we find out that while 66% of what gets approved to be built in the city of Vancouver is for incomes above a professional income level, that really it's only 40% of households in the city of Vancouver that make that type of income. Conversely, when we talk about that population that makes a living wage or less, we actually find that it's about 2013, so about 35% of the 39% of the population earns less than a living wage. And so it kind of shows you that connection or disconnection between incomes and what's been approved to be built. Now, from this perspective, it's also going from approvals, and there are any number of ways of measuring what's going to be coming online. That another way of ways of looking at what's coming online is also really the role of what types of housing are getting completed, and really what kind of tenure, if you will, of units of those housing units are being completed in the city of Vancouver. And in that type of analyses, we actually find that from 2009 to 2018, that the majority of what kinds of housing units are being approved are market ownership. That market ownership really is the foundation of what gets completed in the city of Vancouver. And I think that fortunately, we've seen increases in terms of market rental. That market rental is still a small band of what gets completed in terms of housing completions in the city of Vancouver. I should note that this is a gross number. This does not necessarily account for the units that have been replaced or displaced when we talk about completions. And I think that being said, an even smaller band is actually non-market, that when it comes to non-market housing in the city of Vancouver, there have been years where there haven't been any units completed in the city of Vancouver for non-market. And I think that versus, I think with the change in government and the reinvestment in non-market, that we've seen a slow and steady increase of non-market housing that is being completed. And so I think that this really gives you an anchor towards a perspective of what gets built in Vancouver and for whom. And so really at this point, I end with an image. And I think that this image is really what draws us here today. And it really is this type of conversation that we're here today to really ensure that Hope and Vancouver are not on two different roads, but that they can ultimately remain in the same destination. Thank you.
So Andy, you gave us a lot of good stuff there. We know that 66% of the housing that's built is only affordable to people who make more than $80,000. We see that there's a lot of hidden rental throughout the city, that maybe single family houses aren't necessarily for single families, that people are actually being pretty resourceful. What's the biggest shocker for you? Like, what is the biggest takeaway when you look at numbers like this?
I think that you really highlighted really what are some of the biggest takeaways, and actually how much this has been a city, how long the city has been a city of renters for over 50 years. But then mixed into this conversation is actually how much harder it is to be a renter in the city of Vancouver. That, of course, for a certain population in the city of Vancouver, housing has always been difficult. It's always been a struggle. And I think that it's important to understand that. But that moving forward, I think in particular in the last 16 years, in the last 16 years, that we've really seen how much, or one can round it up to 20 years, that we really see how housing has been a struggle, particularly for renters. And it's actually how difficult renting is. I mean, because renting isn't only about affordability, but I think it's also about accessibility. That is it even available, but mixed in with the concerns about stability and security, that is it available for a long time, that we also then have the fourth component, which is really the suitability, that is this the right size for a particular household. So it's in that kind of combination. I think that it's actually the meta in this conversation is actually how much harder it has become to be a renter in the city of Vancouver.
And it ties in with that discussion about the decoupling of incomes from housing costs, housing prices, right? Rents and ownership and what have you. I guess we either start making more money or we bring the cost of housing down. I mean, do you think that the policy approach should be to recouple our incomes with our cost of housing somehow? Like, should that be a focus that we're kind of missing?
Well, it's interesting because I think that it's talking about how a citywide plan isn't just going to be one about housing or what forms of housing, but how it fundamentally is, if you will, the meta, the boss move for the citywide plan is part of talking about recoupling income and housing. And I think that begins to understand the relationships between not only housing, but then also economic development. And within economic development, the transportation and how those three really bring into that discussion of creating, and we will have a future event about complete communities and complete neighborhoods, that it's the idea of creating that type of completeness. And that is one of the major challenges for the ongoing plan.
Okay. Hey, thank you, Andy. I know that we've got more poll questions, right, Meg?
Yeah, we're gonna, yes, I can tell that this has really peppered the beginning of the discussion with some great data, and the chat window and the Q&A window, Andy, are blowing up with appreciation for your compilation of data and analysis. Thank you for that.
Yeah, it's kind of going nuts over there.
Yeah.
Their questions are coming in, comments are coming in.
And of course, what's missing from your data?
I think.
Stay tuned to find out. So let's move on to poll question 2, if we can, Seth, which is, what types of housing should the city be creating or encouraging through policy? And you can select up to 3 here. So I'll give you 30 seconds or so. And I'm sure Andy would be the first to admit that there's a lot of wiggle room in the way that what counts as a secondary rental, as a primary rental, as different kinds of housing is finessed through the way that data is collected, and the way that different kinds of housing are actually available is not obvious. But where should we be looking for solutions? Okay, just maybe 5 more seconds.
I think as we're getting this, I think one important to note is very much the issue of aging in community. And that's something that I didn't necessarily address, but perhaps for future presentations to really talk about really aging communities and how we are facing an aging city, and how we, I think, work with and to ensure that our elders have safe and secure housing. Because after all, seniors are the fastest growing homeless population in the city of Vancouver. And I think this is an enormous challenge ahead of us.
Yeah, thanks. I did notice some of those heartbreaking comments about seniors. So here we go. So we've got a lot of appetite for co-ops.
Right on.
So probably some co-op dwellers in the audience, perhaps from the early stage post-World War II co-ops, and maybe some of the new co-ops that have been popping up more recently in the city, and people who would like to take advantage of that kind of living arrangement. Second, what was second? Oh, hey,
below market housing. Below market housing.
Below market, okay.
Yeah.
And someone was asking what supportive housing is. And I think William Azeroff will probably be in a good position to really make that distinction between community housing and supportive housing, which offers more kinds of, more than a roof overhead in order to support people who are more vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
We had one more poll to throw up before we get into the other panelists. So this poll question is, what housing protection measures should the city prioritize or continue prioritizing? And there should be up to 3 options for you to select, or I have been keeping note of some of the comments that people are making in the other box as well in the chat. So please take a look. There's an interesting comment, Andy, that it would have been nice to see data on square footage of units being built. That would be an interesting way to cut the development, the construction.
That's a great ask for the City of Vancouver. And I know that there's great members of the city's housing team. And I think the gauntlet is up to you folks.
Okay, so 5 more seconds. We're getting some great ideas in for the other as well for this, housing protection measures. Rent banks, vacancy control.
It's interesting. One good question about how it's entrenched in our society that renters they're basically lower down on a social hierarchy. I think that's an important point too.
And I think part of this type, and I really, if you want to look at policy solutions, at least from a data perspective, I think really one of the actually missing gaps, since, and it's surprising for a city that where rental is so expensive or so extensive and expensive, it's actually, I think, really fundamentally how we are in need of a rental registry. That I think that we fundamentally need a systemized count of rents, of where we rent and what it comes forward in terms of rentals. So I think I put that out as my personal ask for the plan. For the plan is to look at the development of a rental registry.
What would that look like, Andy? I'm trying to picture it. So you would register all the rental units in your building, or?
Yes, you see examples actually in Seattle and actually a number of cities in the United States and abroad in terms of really getting a hold of really what your rental stock looks like, as opposed to what people think rental is. You get a sense of what is your rental stock.
And would that include secondary rental?
Yes, very much so. It would include secondary rental, because then it also is a means of really understanding the role of short-term rental. You think about really actually the big challenges towards rental housing is actually how short-term rental, aka Airbnb, has really challenged the rental stock. And I think about the work of David Walksmith, who incidentally won the CMHC medal for housing research, and his groundbreaking research at the effects of short-term rental on the rental housing pools across Canada and in the United States.
Okay, so Andy has definitely put in his other alternative for the best housing protection measure. Lots of votes coming in as well for that, but we've got the most popular protection measure, protecting existing rental stock, followed closely by reducing speculation. I noticed also in the chat box a push for government acquisition of land in order to protect housing.
Interesting. So we've got people in favor of an empty homes tax, it looks like, and public funding, government funding.
Okay, I'd like to move on to our panel discussion from this point of productive conversation. And just, I think that we have also put the Padlet links again into the chat window. I've noticed there's just a rapid flow of information into the chat window. And if you want those ideas to be captured beyond this conversation, it would be a good idea to include them in the Padlet boards as well, if that's convenient for you to do so. Please also keep tabs on the question and answer box. There's also lots of activity there. So as we move into our panel, you can also upvote the questions, which I notice some people doing, if you really want to sort of add your voice to make sure that that question gets addressed. So again, I'm not going to provide a very lengthy bio for each of our panelists, but I will just say again how fortunate we are to have this panel with us today. And let's kick it off. Carrie, do you want to start?
Sure. So we'll start with Evan Siddell, who's the president and CEO of the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. His team's goal is that by 2030, everyone in Canada will have a home that they can afford and that meets their needs. So Evan, you're also the first head of CMHC to say, or to express the view that Canadians have too much home ownership and that home ownership has become a problem. I wonder, is home ownership the problem or is speculation the problem? And bear in mind, you're talking to a Vancouver audience. Oh, do we have a sound issue? Oh, we've lost Evan.
Check your cord maybe, because your sound was fine before.
Yeah.
It was Leilani. She found a way to kill your mic so that she could have more time.
Unfair and never. Unfair and never.
Okay, I know that public school, oh, can you?
Evan, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hello.
Oh, good. Okay, I'm back. Thank you for that. I'll try and pick this up.
Okay.
By the way, Andy, terrific start to the presentation. Really great. Before I start, I'm here now in the city of Toronto, right, as I speak to you, which is the traditional territory of many nations, but I will highlight the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. In addition to, it is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people as well. I will say, you know, this is a crucial conversation, of course. A guy called Matthew Desmond wrote a terrific book called Evicted, and he called housing or home the root of the wellspring of humanity and the center of life. And this crucial conversation about ownership versus renting, I'll turn to your question right now. I'm not opposed to home ownership. I'm opposed to the glorification of home ownership, which is the kind of thing from a policy point of view that is creating discrimination against renters. It's taking our eye off the ball of where we need to invest, which is in helping renters, not in helping homeowners. A study was done a few years ago that actually suggested that government support in total, that's federal, provincial, municipal, and probably would not have included Indigenous government, but could, is 15 to 1 dollars supporting owners versus renters. And that's upside down, it seems to me, from a needs point of view. And so it's the glorification of home ownership that I'm concerned about. Renting is a very healthy form of tenure. In fact, we'll come back to this in the conversation later. It's exactly where global cities are. You know, rental ownership rates in North America are quite high. They'd be very low in places like London. Paris is 1/3. London's about 50%. Montreal, by the way, is only 56%. So, and that's compared to GVRD, by the way. The Greater Vancouver area is more like 64%. I know Andy was using City of Vancouver numbers. So, the data in the surveys, which I hope I can get from you, by the way, is going to be very instructive to us in our work. And let's have a conversation about how we make rental more affordable for people and build the kind of city that we actually want. I think we need a paradigm shift in how we think about our cities. If cities are places for wealthy people, they are not healthy places. And so I'll just say that and leave the rest to other panelists in the continued conversation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Evan.
Yeah, fantastic. Next up, we have Barbara Steenbergen, and I want to just send a quick, underline our thanks to Barbara because she's joining us from Brussels and it is the middle of the night. Barbara is a member of the Executive Committee of the International Union of Tenants based in Brussels, and that organization represents tenants' rights all around the world, including partner organizations here in Vancouver. So Barbara, can you tell us a little bit about what your work entails to fight for tenants' rights worldwide, and what are the most urgent issues for tenants?
Yes, thank you, Meg, and also thank you for the invitation. Hello to everybody in Vancouver. This is Brussels. It is midnight indeed, and we had a wonderful day. I'm bringing you very topical news. A few hours ago, we had the decision of the European Parliament with the last big majority for an enforceable right to housing, for quota to social housing, protection of tenants, security of tenure, and more not-for-profit housing. We have been advocating for this decision of the European Parliament for years, and today it became reality. So I think it's a very, very special day for us here in Europe, and I'm happy to share this really great news with you all over in Vancouver. Yeah, what we are doing, perhaps this is the introduction, what we are doing. We are working on good legislation for protection of tenants, for security of tenure, for more not-for-profit, public housing, affordable housing, accessibility of housing, all that in, I think, a very concerted way. We have all over the world more than 78 member unions. We are very, very strong in Europe. only in Europe, and I'm heading the European office of the International Union of Tenants. We represent more than 20 million organized tenants, and we fight for our rights. We are a very old movement. We have been founded in 1926, and we are part of the social movement. So to describe it, perhaps in an easy way, we are the trade union for tenants. We are fighting for affordable rents. We are fighting for rent freezes. We are fighting in front of the court for our members, and this is our job. And I'm very happy to do this job for more than 20 years. And I can tell you, it's really a work you can do for a lifetime. And I'm happy to share my experiences with you here, and also some good, perhaps, ideas from Europe for legislation in Canada.
Great.
Okay, so that's
Thank
a
you,
good start. Very,
Mhm.
very auspicious news that you have to share with us about how tenants can actually fight for their legal rights and achieve that kind of security that is needed.
And we've got Leilani Farha here today. Leilani is the global director of The Shift, an organization that aims to end homelessness, unaffordability, and evictions. And Leilani was the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing up until I think a year ago. And she's with us.
The UN special.
The UN.
Your voice cut out just.
Did it? Oh no. I think, okay, the UN Special Rapporteur, I think it was for adequate housing. Isn't that the title, Leilani?
Yeah.
Okay. And Leilani has spoken before about the financialization of housing and how that's harming us as a society. And I was wondering if she could maybe talk, I don't know if everyone understands what's meant by the financialization of housing. And maybe you could explain how it impacts us directly, like boots on the ground.
Sure. First of all, a big thanks for inviting me into this conversation. It is timely and hugely important. I need to say a couple things just as preambular. One, I'm sitting in my home, which is on the banks of the Kitchissippi River, which is also called the Ottawa River now. And it is the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe. I also want to say, you know, all of the work I've done on the financialization of housing, which I will talk about in 1 second, it all started actually in Vancouver. And it all started because of a very warm invitation by Andy Yan to a mega conference he was hosting with all of the bright lights who were talking about financialization, academics from all around the world, but who weren't necessarily doing it from a human rights place, which is where I come at it from, but they were all gathered, and Andy introduced me to everyone, including you, Carrie. That is where I first met you. So just, yep. I feel this is like a really nice place for me to be. Yeah, so the financialization, I mean, some people assume that what I'm concerned about is just the fact of housing being in the private market, that I don't like home ownership. That I don't like capitalism, and that's what financialization, my attack on financialization is about, and it's not. Financialization is a very particular phenomenon, at least the definition I use and the work that I do on it and my concerns. And it really is where housing is viewed as an uber commodity. And I'm not talking about the individual person who buys a house and is kind of chuffed when their property value goes up. I'm not saying that that's not problematic. Maybe it's problematic, but that's not what I'm talking about when I talk about financialization. I'm talking about institutional investors. The private equity firms, the asset management firms that have billions of dollars invested in residential real estate. I'm talking about companies that you know in Vancouver, like Starlight, okay? Starlight has about $20 billion of assets under management. They are a very big multinational investor in residential real estate. And they do it in two ways in Vancouver. They are buying up your stock, the stock that Andy talked about, and they're also doing purpose-built rental. And my concern, you want boots on the ground with companies like Starlight, and it is not exclusively Starlight. I'm only using Starlight as an example. I want to be, it's not fair because there's a lot of these actors out there. Timber Creek's another big one in Canada, for example, that's wreaked havoc in Ottawa. Blackstone is the largest private equity firm in the world. They're very engaged in this and are actually an institutional partner with Starlight, for example, or they were. I don't know if they still are. What they do is their business model, when they purchase existing rental, is they do upgrades. Some tenants will say these are often unnecessary and cosmetic upgrades, unwanted upgrades. I think sometimes they're probably important upgrades. They are buying often what they consider to be undervalued properties, which means often properties that have been left not well upkept, for example, older properties from the 60s and 70s. And what they do is they do these upgrades and they pass on, they would say, the cost of those upgrades to tenants. And the way that they do that in some places like Toronto, for example, is by applying for above guideline rent increases. And we know from the pandemic that renters, and from Andy's incredible graphs, I just love them. Please send them to me, Andy. We know people are living on the edge. We know that when the pandemic struck, after 2 months of economic instability, people were saying, I don't know how I'm going to pay my rent. So when a financial institutional owner increases rents, that puts tenants in a very precarious position. And that's my concern with their attachment to purchasing rental housing. And the reason they do it is because that's how they make their profits. I'm not going to get into the technical side of how they use a financial mechanism, vehicle, an instrument to do this. They're called real estate investment trusts. We can get deep into that later, perhaps. So when I see on the poll that what people are most concerned about, homelessness and unaffordability of rents, and then we say, oh, but people aren't so, on this call, people aren't so concerned about speculation. Well, they are, because they are concerned about the result of speculation. That is the outcome of speculation. And so I just wanted to say that. The other thing I wanted to say, I'm sorry, I know I'm going on too long, but I just wanted to say, what I think is so interesting in this third last poll, whatever it was, about what should we do, I liked that people pivoted to speculation because, and I think we're super lucky to have Evan on this call, because I do think that a lot of this happens because of historic and ongoing policies at the national level that encourage this kind of speculation, or as I call it, financialization. I'm going to stop there.
Mm-hmm. And this will tie in with a bigger conversation about our dependency on the market, perhaps, to get us out of this crisis. And once we get through the introductory remarks from everybody, maybe we could, launch into that topic, which is a pretty big one.
Thanks, Carrie. We had a couple of comments that I've noticed that wondering if there are any housing developers on the panel. And in fact, our next two panelists are both housing developers. Our next panelist is Kilsalem, and he's a counselor for the Squamish Nation. And Kilsalem, I was just trying to watch your YouTube video to figure out how to pronounce your nationality, as well as a member of the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation. And his work has been focused is progressive social change. he is also a participant in the major developments that are currently being led by the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Development Corporation, as well as other nation-specific housing developers in this region, and that's set to provide a substantial proportion of the city's new rental housing stock in coming years. What will this look like, Kilsalem, and how will it be different from what other market rental housing developments offer?
Hi, everybody, and thank you for the introduction. I'm going to try and run through a bunch of pieces because, one, I want to try to weave in a response to, I think, some of the other comments and questions that have come up, but also just explain what I think is central to this conversation about housing and particularly focusing on renters and rental. So the Squamish Nation is planning to build about 6,000 units of rental on a piece of property that's about 10 acres. We also have another 90-acre development happening with the Jericho lands, another 40-acre property on Heather Street, and then we also have some other properties that aren't necessarily in the City of Vancouver, but are being developed by the nations. We also own significant pieces of reserve property on the North Shore, and then for Musqueam, who is, I don't want to speak on behalf of, but just mentioning that they're also doing housing developments on some of their lands down in South Vancouver. And we continue to press all levels of government to repatriate and return land to the nations in the spirit of UNDRIP, which Article 27 talks to specifically the repatriation of Indigenous lands that have been confiscated, taken, etc., or to be compensated for our lands that have been confiscated. We are choosing to enter into the real estate area because so much of our lands have been alienated us in terms of natural resources. Unlike a lot of other First Nations that can use sustainable natural resource economic development, our lands have been completely obliterated for the city to exist. The city has been completely built on our territory, on areas that used to be our villages, our homes, our communities, but also our save-on and our churches and our places of gathering for cultural, spiritual sustenance. I can't hunt for elk in the False Creek Flats like my great-grandparents could have. So this drives home that we are jumping into what has happened in our territory for 150 years that we've seen very little benefit from. But also see it as an opportunity to not just succeed for our communities, but to give back to the city, and fundamentally believe that the delivering of a significant amount of housing rapidly is the solution that we need in our city. Fundamentally, the City of Vancouver is not building enough housing. The region is not building enough housing. And what we have in Metro Vancouver and in the City of Vancouver and all the neighboring municipalities is that we have land use policy acting as, or we have land use policy acting as a migration policy, because the lack of ability for Vancouver and the region to keep up with the pace of growth in both terms of population and jobs means that we have unaffordable housing prices, coupled with a number of other influences. The low interest rates set by Canada have completely exacerbated the housing problem within our cities. And this is a point that has been raised by CMHC, for example, that if you go back to, say, the 90s and 80s and before, when mortgages were had a higher carrying cost in terms of the interest rates. But when you look at the interest rates that we have now, coupled with the extremely low property taxes that we have in Vancouver, Vancouver's prime for speculation. And it's not about foreign speculators. It's about all speculators, whether foreign or domestic, that are causing rampant increases in the housing unaffordability. But this takes us to what are the solutions, and what, like, that's the problem. What are the solutions? For that graph that Andy posted earlier, one of the things that I think is challenging about that graph is that for anything under an income of $50,000 and below, the amount of subsidies that are required to provide housing, to pay off mortgages and the financing for the construction of new affordable housing, the subsidies to ensure that those rates are affordable for those incomes require huge amounts of subsidies from other levels of government to pay for that. So although the point, I think, of Andy's slide is that the City of Vancouver is not building enough of those types of housing, the reality is, or what wasn't said, is that federal and provincial governments need to step in to be able to increase the amount of housing at those levels. Now, the city also has a role. It's not to let them off the hook. And they've been doing a really good job so far at finding innovative ways to include inclusionary zoning to put affordability requirements on the market developments that are happening within the city. That could increase, there could be more of that. And the way that the city can do that is by increasing the density allowances throughout the city, allowing for higher increases of density in exchange for more affordability or more amount of units on the projects. Or the other one is that it could raise property taxes to be able to generate the income to start building its own affordable units. Now, all of those solutions have various opinions on whether people want those ideas implemented. Some people don't like high property taxes or higher property taxes. I imagine for a lot of the single family or single detached homeowners throughout the city who have seen massive increases in value on their wealth, where they have used their homes as a source of generating wealth for themselves, probably would not want an increase in property taxes. But as it was highlighted, they're not the majority. The majority of our city are renters. And I think that that focus on just new builds and that what type of income new builds are serving, it doesn't address the fact that all of our existing, many of our existing homes in our city, the single detached homes that most of our city is, most of the new units that are being built in our city are single detached homes, are not serving the incomes of our communities either. So it's one thing to target buildings or projects that are serving incomes around 80,000 or 90,000 or 75,000 or around the median. But we still have this other problem, which is the amount of housing that is being built of a particular type as a result of specific land use policies that are holding our city back. That's a huge, huge, huge part of the problem. But I think that that's shifting as we see more and more young people, especially, and more renters speaking about the need for a massive increase in both purpose-built rental, community-owned housing and things like co-ops and nonprofit housing, or attainable housing models that different developers, including the MSC nations, are using to provide a means for even attainable home ownership or workforce housing for people like our doctors, our firemen, our nurses, things like that. So there's a lot to unpack. And the biggest thing I'll leave with is that the problem with so much of this debate around housing and which direction we should go in is that it's a spectrum. There are different considerations for each part of that spectrum, and the tools and solutions to address each of those parts of the spectrum are unique as well, that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think that that's what's so problematic about those two poll questions that were posed today, is that it's not a zero-sum game. Those solutions or those priorities are not mutually exclusive. Governments can do more than one thing at one time. And the City of Vancouver, for example, is doing all of those things. So picking a prioritization of each of them probably won't help us inform us much about which way we should go in, because the reality is either we're doing them all or we should be doing them all. But we are moving in that direction. And I think that there are examples around North America, especially, where we're seeing massive zoning reform as a way to start addressing some of these issues.
Thanks very much. Our final panelist.
Yes, William Azaroff is the CEO of Brightside Community Homes Foundation, an organization dedicated to making housing accessible for people who struggle to meet the demands of market rate housing. Hi, William.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. So people, so they know, I think it's 26 properties that you own around the Lower Mainland, your organization. How important is it? Because we've seen the case of Little Mountain and some other public properties that were sold off during a very neoliberal time with a neoliberal perspective. How important is it that we keep people who are, vulnerable, low income in their communities and central? In other words, do they have the right, like everybody else, to stay centrally located, even though land values are going up?
Yeah, I think it's really important. People build connections into their community, and I think they want to stay connected to their community. Maybe I'll just say just a quick thing about Brightside. So yeah, Brightside has been around since 1952. We have 26 buildings, all in the City of Vancouver. So on unceded and traditional Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory. we have over 1,000 residents who live amongst these properties, and we have an ambitious goal to double the number of homes we produce. We have over the next by 2030. So what that means is we're going through a process of redeveloping a lot of our properties. A lot of our properties are aging, they're end of life. You know, if you've got a 2-story walk up with a lot of seniors in it, no sprinkler, no elevator, people who are disabled, people who are seniors, they just can't age in place. And it's just, you know, these are like was described earlier, late 60s, maybe early 70s buildings. So what we want to do is redevelop that into a 6-story building with you know, obviously sprinklers and elevators and all those things, a nice amenity room for people to not just get together, but cook meals together once that's allowed again, community gardens, passive house standard in a lot of our cases. So just a really big upgrade. And what we're finding is as we're relocating residents within our portfolio to be able to empty the building so we can knock it down and build something new, we're working with them to understand, do you want to stay in this neighborhood? A lot of people want to move to a different neighborhood where we have other properties, so they can move to the West End, or they can move to Kitsilano, or they can move, you know, wherever. And so they do have reasons why they want to live, you know, near a doctor, near family, near friends, or stay in the community they're in. I think that's an incredibly important aspect to this. That, you know, when we talk about renters' rights, you know, that's a core component to it.
Mm-hmm. And also too, the different types of rental housing. I sometimes wonder if there's an overemphasis on building bachelor suites and 1-bedrooms and very small units that aren't very, you know, conducive to family living or just anybody's lifestyle who wants to get outside and have fresh air. Do you agree that there should be diversity of types of housing forms when it comes to rental?
Yeah, and a question came up earlier about like community housing and supportive housing and things like that. So within the community housing sector, we, you know, it's come up about cooperative housing, and I think cooperative housing has done and is doing an excellent job building a lot of new units now that meet a lot of different needs. You know, 2- and 3-bedroom units, especially, and then, you know, for an aging population, a lot of our residents do want bachelors and 1-bedrooms because they're aging and they're alone. So you need that diversity of unit. And, you know, then there's supportive housing, which is for people who need some level of support. It could be addiction services, it could be mental health supports, it could be physical health supports. They just need, so those organizations are not-for-profits in vast majority of cases, and they have medical or mental health staff on board. And it's, you know, like the name implies, supportive housing. They get supports built in. We're affordable housing, independent living, so we have very deeply affordable. Most of our residents pay 30% of their income on rent, and their incomes are between $15,000 and $30,000 a year. So these are deeply affordable units that for people who can live independently. So we don't offer supportive housing, but just deeply affordable not-for-profit housing owned by, all of these organizations are owned by the community as a not-for-profit structure. We have a volunteer board of directors, and nobody's taking a profit motive out of this housing. So all surpluses can go back into maintenance and upkeep or affordability.
So what do we need? Like, and this is, I think we're opened up to the entire panel now that we've gone through everyone. Sorry,
Carrie.
Meg, did you want to say something?
Well,
Yeah.
I think that I wanted to offer Councillor Kirby Young. I think that I wanted to see if your microphone is, if you wanted to say something.
Is she there? Councillor Kirby Young? Maybe not.
Okay. If not, then I just wanted to thank the panel. And before we get, I know that it's really tempting to dive into some of these juicy issues, but we do have 3 Vancouver renters who recorded short personal stories of their challenges renting currently in Vancouver as people renting with pets, renting with small children, and renting while Indigenous. And I wanted to take about 6 minutes to show this video and reflect on how housing rights and the lack thereof affect Vancouverites today.
Hi, my name is Fiorella Pinillos, and I am a mom of 2 kids under the age of 5. I am also a renter in Vancouver. Our struggle with finding adequate housing started a few months after our first son was born. The walls of our quaint 1-bedroom were not thick enough to contain the noises of our little one's big lungs, so we started the search. It was 2016 and the stock of available two-bedroom rentals had plummeted. We struggled for months to find anything close to our neighborhood at a price range we could afford. By the time my son was 2 years old, we had lived in 4 different apartments. Finding a rental apartment for our family in Vancouver had been quite an odyssey. We were about to give up on Vancouver by the end of 2017 when we finally found a place we could call home. The place we live now is a non-market family rental. And even with its many, many flaws, it has provided a stable and affordable home for us. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dion Ko, and I'm a master's student with SFU Urban Studies. So is Vancouver a city for renters? For myself and perhaps for other folks who also have dogs, the answer is no. So my old rental was a shoddy, decrepit building just off Commercial Drive. We've had holes in the walls and plumbing issues in our unit. Our complaint mostly ignored, but we stayed because the location was good and the rent was cheap. At one point, my partner and I decided to get a dog for many reasons, but mostly for mental health and emotional support. And also because a lot of our neighbors had cats, had animals too, like they had cats roaming around and dogs would come in and out with their owners in tow. The property manager soon found out that we got a new dog, and he arbitrarily enforced a no pet clause on us specifically. At one point, he would knock on our door around 3 times a week, as early as 8 a.m., just to say dogs aren't allowed here. At one point, even waiting outside the building to catch me and my dog on our morning walk. It was around 7 a.m. And pretty soon he served us a notice. And I contested it, of course, and said, "Do you not see all the other cats and dogs that are clearly living here?" To which he said, "Well, tell me which units and I can send them an eviction notice too." Yeah, so I'm pretty fortunate that I no longer live in that building, and today I live in stable housing with my dog and so many other dogs in the building I live in too. But I know I'm not in a majority, so we ought to do better.
Israel, good day, everyone. My name is Andrew Phillips. My traditional name is Chachalitz, and I'm from Musqueam. Here to share a little bit about my story about renting in Vancouver, particularly in my community, Musqueam. I was renting there with a long-term partner for about 2 years, and unfortunately we went separate ways, and so the affordability of renting a basement suite in our lease lands, it's around $1,700, and so that's a little out of my price range to rent on my own. And during my time there, you know, I'm renting on reserve lands, but it's our lease lands. And so I had a bit of a awkward experience with my landlord, who are non-indigenous. And I just, yeah, always felt awkward. They felt comfortable talking to my partner, who is white. And, you know, when I was leaving the basement suite, I had offered to do a walkthrough with my landlord, and my partner had moved away to Europe. So I was in the basement suite for 1 month by myself. And during my walkthrough, or I had asked to do a walkthrough, my landlord said it's okay just to put the keys in the mailbox and that we didn't need to do a walkthrough. And so I did an iPhone video walkthrough just to make sure that, you know, everything was, you know, clean. I left it in good condition. And the my landlord, instead of messaging me, he had emailed my ex-partner, who is in Europe, and saying that it was left in a disaster. You know, that it took him 5 hours to clean. He hired a cleaner for 2 hours, and he took $150 off of our damage deposit. And so that was just, you know, an awkward experience. You know, it felt like racism to me. It felt like, you know, I'm renting on our own reserve lands. And so for me to be renting there, you know, to be trying to make a living, you know, trying to make a home in Vancouver, it was very expensive to do on my own. And, you know, to feel racism in your own backyard, it's just uncomfortable, and I hope people don't have to go through that themselves. And so I ended up moving with my family down the block, my late grandma's house, with my uncle and my brother. And that experience in itself was a learning experience. My uncle, he struggles with addiction, and so having to move from a comfortable living condition family, you just can really see the array just from like 400 meters of leased land to reserve land. And I just would hope that Vancouver would be a more accepting place of Indigenous folks like myself. Hey, Chair.
So I think that those three snapshots really ask us to ground our discussion about what it would mean to take a rights-based approach to housing, as we've committed to do now in Canada. We've seen lots of diverse kinds of stories from some of our participants today, asking about youth aging out of care, what their housing options are, Chinese seniors, people with mental health, people suffering from addictions and on the street often. What are the key things that people can take away for how to materialize a rights-based approach to housing, and how the city can act in that direction, for any of our panelists?
Yeah, perhaps an idea to share. What we in Europe have is a social rent law. We call it a social rent law. And we have been fighting for that for many, many years. But in most of the countries, we do have it, at least, let's say, in Northern and Western Europe. And the consequence of that is that there also the majority of people deliberately chooses to rent because it's the better option for them. I do have the impression, especially after the three statements, that we do not have a real social rent law in Canada. I do think that there is not enough of protection for tenants, that the security of tenure is low, and that people would not choose to be a tenant. And there, I think it's, something in the rights-based approach that you definitely have to change. Because here in Europe, again, perhaps it's a little bit weird to hear, we like to rent because it's the better option. It is cheaper, the offer is good, the quality is good. You will not even recognize social housing in Europe. Social housing looks the same as normal market housing.
It has much better public support, right? Much better support from government.
There is a lot of public support because this is what we call with the technical term tenure neutrality, that there is in some countries, not in every country, there is not a discrimination of rental housing.
Yeah.
In many, many countries, we have a lot of subsidies for home ownership, with the effect that the prices then are increasing. When you have subsidies, the prices are increasing. But in many countries, we do not have that so much anymore. And the change came actually in the last 10 years, where we have seen that renting in Europe also became more and more unaffordable. And we had massive problems to have people coming to the cities and doing the work. And especially we had a problem to house key workers in our cities. And cities only function with key workers. And these are mostly people with middle incomes. So there was a change in policy when people said, okay, we have to also give an offer to those people. But this policy took quite a long time. And I think you are at the beginning of a way. And therefore, it's extremely important that all those people here together share this thought and fight for it, because this is coming only with a big support from the citizens, from the grassroots. This is not only policy making. This must come from the ground, and it must come, if I may say so, from the organized ground, from the tenants union, for all those people fighting for more affordable housing. Then you have a big chance to have good legislation. Perhaps
Right.
this as a start.
I think it's time for me to stick my neck out and give people something to shoot at. I know Leilani's just rubbing her hands together. I'll say a few things, if I may, about the human rights-based approach to housing. So we do have, in the National Housing Strategy Act, some constructs around a rights-based approach to housing, which is basically administrative procedure through something called the National Housing Council that I co-chair with another person. And we will have a federal housing advocate, and that group is empowered to look at systemic housing issues, and we are going to put resources behind that. It is not a grievance-based process, however, and the reason for that is simply that the federal jurisdiction doesn't extend there. Leilani's done a lot of great work with foreign governments, with provinces, with cities, and we need to have a more integrated approach to rights-based housing, and she'll talk about that. I'll just say briefly what we're doing from a federal government point of view. The National Housing Strategy includes a Canada Housing Benefit, which is a multi-billion-dollar investment that gets money into the hands of people to use to pay rent. There are other programs too I'm not going to go through. There's this very substantial program, however, that is meant to create supply. It's called the Rental Construction Financing Initiative. Leilani quite correctly talked about this problem of, she'd call it rent evictions, but where people are taking old stock, investing in it, and making it unaffordable for the people who were in it before. That stock has to be replaced somehow. We do need not foreign investment. We need some of that. We need investors to create the supply of new housing. That's a separate issue, because it's only with the supply of new housing that we can moderate prices and maybe even have them reduce in terms of rental terms. And the federal government's doing what it can for that. So if someone's proposing a market-based rental property, they can come to us through this rental construction financing initiative. We now have $25.75 billion to spend. That's 10 times where it started. And that basically buys down rents. That's how it works, that in return for low interest rates, we buy down rents for people. In Vancouver, the most affordable project we've been associated with is almost a 1/3 reduction in rent in that particular project. On average, it's not that much of a reduction, but we have achieved that in Vancouver. And then about the same amount of investment by the federal government. So the cost of that $25.75 billion program is really about $1 billion, because most of its money we're going to get back. We've also launched a $1 billion rapid housing initiative just in the past several months. It's directed towards homeless folks, and the money was spent substantially in our major cities for the first half of it, and then another half of it, another $500 million is going to specific projects. That was oversubscribed by about 200%, and we are hoping we can get more money from the federal government, but that's their choice. I will stop there. I've probably given people lots to shoot at. I'm watching for Leilani to nod vigorously.
I know I have a question. And I'll let Leilani jump in if she did you. I'll let you go after. I just want to ask you, the construction program, the low interest rate construction program, from what I understand, they only have to provide affordable housing for 10 years. And I'm just wondering what happens after that. Does it convert to market rate if they choose to?
It can. Yes, it can. The minimum threshold is 10 years, but we're achieving substantially more than that through competition for this money. So the minimum threshold is 10 years, but we have many that, I actually couldn't quantify it for you, but a significant number that are double that, 20 years, and some that are actually permanent, just through the competition among developers for this money.
Okay. Because my concern would be that after 10 years, if the units start converting back to market rate, the affordability piece is completely lost. And that this is not just about affordable housing, but about secure long-term affordable housing.
That's right. But as Khasalem said earlier, we have a housing continuum, and new supply is good. Any form of supply is good in a market. We want it more to be affordable. I agree with that, but it's not that it's not good if it's not affordable. It's less good.
Let's talk about the any supply is good in the market argument, because as you might know, a lot of people, there are critics of that argument, because we've seen rezoning for more density in the West End and along the Canby corridor and other parts of the city, and it has not translated into affordable housing. So there are skeptics who don't believe that that's going to be the case, that the more you build, somehow we're magically going to get prices down. Some would argue that you need affordable new supply, not just any kind of new supply.
Affordable new supply is better, but all things being equal, more supply reduces price growth and prices. That's for sure the case.
Do we know that? Is that a fact?
That's an Kelsalem, do you want to? Kelsalem's aching to get in here, I know.
Okay.
So to tie that, I think that question also to what the broader question is. So there's one fundamental fact about the city of Vancouver that's really challenging. About 10% of the housing that gets built in Vancouver is non-market. The other 90% is market. And the city of Vancouver, as elected leaders, have to decide on what to do with all of the market, aka private land that people own, whether it's individuals with single detached homes or whether it's large corporations that are real estate property developers. Supply and demand absolutely impact price. And we've seen this in the pandemic. We're seeing it locally, we're seeing it internationally, we're seeing it everywhere, where the changes in supply and demand are driving changes in price. And some of it is down, some of it is flatlining. This argument that in the past, the criticism that it has been tried, that we have tried any supply is good and it didn't work, is actually false, because we haven't actually tried that. If we actually tried that, Squamish wouldn't be able to build 6,000 units on a 10-acre piece of land. If we tried, any market is good, any new supply is good, and allowed everybody to build what the market needed, Squamish wouldn't be able to build that many units. The only reason we can build that many units is, one, because the constraints on the land and constraints on transportation, but also because there's a demand for it. So as long as we don't keep up with that demand, either prices are going to continue to increase, or if we are supplying enough, prices will start to flatline, or theoretically they might even go down. Now, the question then becomes is, how much supply do you need in order to flatline prices or even decrease prices? That's a big question. And this is my point from earlier, which is that we are regionally, it's a regional problem, it's a provincial problem, it's a national problem, because you're using land use policy as an immigration policy and as a migration policy. Because if Vancouver, let's say, tripled its amount of units it was going to build every year, or the whole region, Metro Vancouver was going to triple it overnight within a year, all of a sudden prices start to fluctuate, they start to come down. Now people in Toronto and people and elsewhere in the country start moving to Vancouver because Vancouver has affordable rates. And then boom, there's a big supply now, or a demand coming in, and prices start going up, and people will say, oh, well, we tried lots of supply, it didn't really work. They're all interconnected. And I think that's Evan's point, is these things have an impact on the market. They help us achieve something closer to where we would like to get to. Now, to circle it back to the rights-based approach, what we can do is we can do a couple things. One is we can start moving towards a larger increase of government involvement in non-market housing. And that's an electoral decision, that's a political economy decision, that's who we elect into our governments and what they're promising to do with our money and where they raise it. And it's also how much we allow just private developers to capture the windfall gains within the market. And this is the model that Squamish is doing and the nations are doing. We're acting as a government. We're capturing not just the land lift off the value of our land, we're actually collecting, in the case of Sonat, 50% of all net profits over 99 years. There's no reason why other governments couldn't be entering into the same game and doing the same thing on either lands they own or purchasing land and doing it as well, because they have the control of density and the control over what happens on that land above into the sky.
Leilani, did you want to jump in? I kind of butted in there.
No, I like where the conversation has meandered. I will go back to the rights-based approach because that's where this sort of started. One of the things that I think governments need to get their head around with respect to what a rights-based approach means is that human rights is a way of decision making, and it's a way of governance, it's a way of doing policy and programming. So a human rights approach would, for example, ask Evan, of the 20, that the way you spend money should have human rights outcomes. Can you guarantee that the 25.75 billion for the construction thing is going to have genuine human rights outcomes. And Evan might pivot to me and say, well, yeah, I've already told you, you know, there's going to be some affordable units. And then we need to cast our gaze back to Andy and his stats and his idea of kind of how I envision sort of audits of our rental housing and our need, and say, well, Evan, that's nice that there's going to be X number of affordable units for 20 years. 20 years is not long enough, obviously. X number for permanent, that's great. But how does that measure with need? And are we actually doing calculations that are based on need? That's one of the things I don't like about inclusionary zoning. There's like a global, Barbara will know this, like there's a global thing around inclusionary zoning, where it's like 25% of a building should be, you know, low income, I mean, or affordable, I should say. Why 25%? Why would it be 25% in the city of London, England, and 25% in Ottawa, Canada? That doesn't make sense. Surely the needs in England are going to, in London, might be different than the needs in Ottawa. So a human rights approach really is the aim is to understand need, understand structural barriers, and address need through structural change. So that's all I'm going to say on that. On the issue of affordability and build, and rents will come down. I mean, the question then is, what of those places, those cities with decent vacancy rates and still homelessness? So what do you make of that? Or, and Baltimore is often the example that's given. And I'll tell you what I make of it. I have family in Baltimore and I've spent a fair bit of time there. I make of it racism and discrimination, because some landlords just simply don't want to rent to African Americans and any constellation of African Americans, single African American woman, et cetera, et cetera. And I think in this country, we have very similar things playing out with Indigenous peoples, with racialized BIPOC, et cetera. So there is that issue. And the other thing I'll say about supply is, here's the concern. This goes back to what Barbara was saying. If you build affordable supply, we all applaud. Yay, deeply affordable, we all applaud. But if you don't protect that supply, it is prey to the institutional investors that I was talking about. That's what they're looking for. I mean, they are holding hostage in Spain social housing, right? That's what they go for. That's what they're looking for. So they purchased a huge amount of social housing after the global financial crisis in Spain. And so if you don't have legislative protections to ensure affordable remains affordable, deeply affordable remains deeply affordable, social remains social, those actors are out there and they are not being curbed by any national government anywhere in the world. So I'm going to stop there.
I wonder how Barbara feels about this. What do you think, Barbara? Is any supply of new housing good supply, and is there a way to protect tenants? Like, is it needed that we have regulations in place for affordable housing in the long term, not just temporary?
I'm a fan of regulations. I'm a fan of good legislation. I'm a fan of quota. I'm a fan of black on white. I like fundamental rights approaches, but at the same time, you have to have, again, a good and social rent law, because human rights are sometimes not enforceable. A rent law, you have it, and if your landlord is hurting this law, you come to us and we help you and we protect you even in front of the court. This is the model of tenants unions in Europe. So this is also playing on level playing field. There is no difference between landlords and tenants. We are playing on a level playing field, and the way we react, we work together, is based on respect. There is not one inferior and the other one is superior. This is a good social rent law. So I'm a big fan of this. I'm also a big fan of changing things. It's always about finances, finances, and finances. But obviously, there is a lot of finance in Vancouver running around. There is a lot of money running around because there is a lot of speculative investment in your country. And I think the Canadian housing bubble is well known worldwide. So this is happening in your country. So you have to do something against financialization. And the only thing that you, I think, can effectively do something is about doing a good zoning law, and perhaps even close the selling of land for new developers who do not respect maximum rents. For instance, if you want to build a house in the beautiful city of Vienna, and the land, the building ground is owned by Vienna, the city of Vienna has a new building law saying the maximum rent per square meter is €5. Otherwise, you will not get the land. So, ladies and gentlemen, yes, I am a fan of legislation. Absolutely, it helps.
Penny,
Yeah.
sorry,
Sorry, go
the
ahead.
Vienna example is a great example because you can't just legislate and regulate this issue in a market environment, because what will happen is either quality is going to suffer, and people are going to have worse and worse housing and the problem gets worse, or if there's not enough housing money invested into housing to support new supply, it just means that rents are going to go up and people are going to get poor in a different way and we'll have more housing need. So legislation and regulation alone is not enough, and it's a political cop-out. It has to come with investment as well.
Right.
Investment, but I wanted to add the other dimension that that Leilani raised, but I don't think we've really fully addressed, and it's come up in a number of the questions that I see in the Q&A, which is about the social part of social rent, which is the value that we see in renting and in renters. So is there so the question here is how can we shift how we value renters? Is it important for our cities, the place where you started, Evan? Like, isn't that a crazy thing to ask Canadians to say we value we value non-wealth in our cities? How do you actually get to that kind of a change in our social perception of what our cities are supposed to be and who lives here and who has the right to live here?
Well, this theory that the only way to make money is off housing is actually not true, and it's not borne out by the facts. So, housing actually costs more than people realize. This idea that you can't get wealthy as a renter is actually not true in and of itself. We've given way too much financial support from governments, tax-free capital gains on housing compared to other investments. Like, basically what we've done is we've tipped the favor in favor of ownership, tipped the scales in favor of ownership, and that's perverting the outcome.
So maybe we should go back to subsidizing co-ops and co-housing and other forms of affordable housing that actually empower people. Would the federal government want to get?
We do that already. Like, there's a number of programs, CMHC, BC Housing, that is funding those things. The level and quantum of how much they should or shouldn't be funding is obviously up for debate. I think everybody would agree it should be more.
I don't think we're doing it in the levels we were doing it in the 1970s or whatever.
Yeah. No, we aren't, and we're also playing catch up in that regard. I mean, it's like, let's say provincially, there was one analysis that the amount of money the BC NDP are spending on housing since they got elected into government recently is basically the amount that they were spending the last time when they were in government, but accounting for inflation. They're not spending at a rate of making up for 16 years of the BC Liberals not funding social housing. They're just kind of jumping back into the game and continuing where they left off. So there's like the gap, and to catch up on that. And then there's also, I think the kind of what Evan was talking about, which is that there has been a successive amount of law and regulation and programs that have been built up that tilt things in favor of homeowners. The capital gains is a huge one. The homeowner grant here in BC is another one. These are massive, massive giveaways of public money to homeowners that renters don't have access to at the same level of equity. So there's a question there. Do you give more money to renters through some sort of tool or instrument, or do you take away a tool or instrument that's been given to homeowners? And that's a policy question. That's a political economy question. I think some of us would probably say take it away from the homeowners over time, but the homeowners might disagree with that because they're getting the massive material gain from it. So those are some of the policy questions. And I think in terms of regulation, that's at a provincial level and a federal level, and capital gains federal and the homeowner grant at provincial.
Yeah, maybe I can jump in here. Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I just keep thinking about Andy's slide about the mismatch between incomes and the type of housing we built. And so I just think we have to look at, the realities in Vancouver, even though not-for-profits are probably building and community housing organizations are building more housing than they have over the last 30 years right now because of CMHC programs and BC housing programs. The reality is because of what Leilani and others have talked about, REITs buying older buildings and upgrading them, and putting people out, that we're losing a lot of units at $1,000 less in the city. So even though we're building more than we have in the last few decades, we're losing more than we're building. So we're falling behind. And I think coming back to sort of this being a City of Vancouver event, I do think that there are I think there are disconnects at the city, and I say this with all due respect because we have 26 buildings in the city, we work closely with the city. Everyone I work with at the city is super bright and dedicated and hardworking and caring, and yet, and I don't want to make this an us versus them thing, but there's such a fear of the local homeowners that if we take a project that we're trying to build 200 units of affordable housing, and working with city staff to get it ready for open houses, public opinion, and ultimately a rezoning public hearing with the city council, we are asked to shave off a story, set back further from the perimeter of the property, step back, so like on the third floor of the property, bring it in, and all those things. A 200-unit building, by the time it gets to the public, is 145 units. By the time it's like to rezoning, it's 140 units, and that's still pretty good. But those 60 units that will never be built over the 60-year duration of the property could house another hundreds of people over the lifetime of the building. And then what's frustrating from my point of view is then you get in front of city council, and city councilors who want to see this kind of housing get built say, oh, couldn't this be higher? Couldn't this have more units? So the fundamental disconnect between the way the rezoning process happens to sort of shave down units, 5 here, 10 here, 15 here, and what we ultimately want to see, which is more of this affordable, social, not-for-profit community housing being built. So I do think that there are sort of left and right hand policy instruments that the city can have to make it easier, faster, and honestly just less expensive for organizations like ours to build. Because we need to see, I agree that on a certain level, I agree that all housing is good, but because we have such a mismatch really in Vancouver, we need to focus on is that low end of market, affordable, not-for-profit housing. How do we make it easier for these organizations that are run by volunteer boards and don't have access to the kind of equity stacks that private developers have? How do we make it easier?
And doesn't that tie in too with what Barbara was saying, and that if we have, instead of going into war with property owners, how about empowering tenants and throwing more money at forms of housing that are truly affordable and secure, and empowering them that way so that it doesn't turn into a big war with property owners and developers buying up land and making quite substantial profits. Maybe the profits don't need to be so big. Maybe there's a way to get into the public housing game again for the federal government in a truly meaningful way, where people have secure housing, like Little Mountain. It was 700 people, low-income people, displaced needlessly. I mean, we were in the housing game before, and isn't that the rights-based approach, that you truly believe that people are entitled to a shelter, to a house, to a home over their heads? I mean, it would seem to be you wouldn't go down that road with healthcare to privatize it
but that's a good point. So that's an example, I think, that's used by a lot of progressive discourse around housing, and then a comparison to healthcare in the States, right? Because we see a lot of the discussion around, the States moving towards a single payer system, kind of like what Canada has. But to go from a system of housing where it is the vast majority of it is market, and then to move to a completely non-market, like if tomorrow we were to go, the Vienna model, which I think it's used a lot, the greatest lesson we could take from the Vienna model is that we should have had a socialist revolution 80 years ago. Because everything from that point on is we're dealing with apples and oranges. And if everything was publicly owned and we didn't have a private market in terms of housing, or it was even reversed, where 10% was private and 90% was non-market, we would call what we have today a housing shortage still. And we would say we would have long wait lists for non-market housing units, and we would still have to build more. So when you have a system that was like largely market, and we want to get to a position where, you know, we're at 10, let's say it's 10%, how do we get to 20? How do we get to 30? How do we get to 40? How do we get to 50? If our goal is to get to 90% of our housing in Canada being non-market, we have to move in a particular direction. There's different ways we can do that. Some of what CMHC is doing and the feds are doing through their investment in non-market housing, province and non-market housing is one way. The inclusionary zoning policies at a municipal level is another way, which is to force the private market to deliver on certain things. But one of the challenges I think too, that I think William's probably familiar with, we're not, which I think is why people are so excited about the Squamish project, but we are, I think, even on some of our fee simple lands, is whether you're building a 6-story market rental, or whether you're building a 6-story co-op or a 6-story affordable housing project, in either situation, people will show up and find excuses to oppose it at a public hearing and demand that the city council kibosh it because of this or that. In one place, it doesn't fit with the neighborhood character. In another place, they're saying it's not affordable enough. And people will come up with all kinds of excuses, sometimes in bad faith, because they just don't want housing in their neighborhood. They don't want new housing. And I call this the last man across the drawbridge mentality, which is like people got in, they got in good, they got their house in the 90s and their property values have gone up massively. And you know, they might complain that their property taxes are too high now. But my question to those people is, how much money did you make over the last 30 years or 20 years?
But isn't that why you want a citywide plan?
I think that is a great question to put to Councillor Kirby-Young, who I think is ready to let us know how these ideas are going to be taken into consideration in Vancouver Plan.
Hi, did everybody hear me?
If you speak up.
Fantastic, I'm so glad. Yeah, I want to thank everybody for great discussion this afternoon, and it's almost similar to having a council meeting, because these are a lot of the issues that we grapple with, and that we talk about in terms of what the city can do, what's our role, and you know, how can we do it within policies. I think what I've heard today, and I would reflect back, is that it's not a black and white, and it's not a gray, and it's not an either or on these scenarios. We're going to need all levels of government working together and a number of different tools to accomplish that. You have identified a lot of the challenges that we grapple with, but I would also offer that I think it's going to require a lot of people coming together towards this progressive improvement, because inclusionary zoning, people will argue when we get a project, well, it's not enough units. I think that was raised earlier. Is it better than what we had yesterday if we approve a particular project and then we move on the next day to try to strengthen those policies and move forward? And I think a lot of those issues are ones that we are sort of deeply faced with. We've seen the practical impact of, I think William referenced it, with the financing and the rental construction financing initiative, and what a difference that can make, because we will have an applicant that comes to council, says, I want to build this rental housing project. Council says, okay, great. What's the level of affordability? Well, I can't quite say right now, but I'm hopeful for the financing. Same applicant comes back a few months later. They have another project. They received housing or funding, I should say, financing from that program. And lo and behold, they're able to make a number of those units at 30% below market. So the tools really do make a difference. The regulation makes a difference, not on its own. I think those points were really well taken, because it's also about the supply. But at a human level, I would reflect back that, you know, people talk about, well, it's a city for renters. I would argue that we're trying to make a city for people, some of whom happen to be renters, some of whom happen to live in social housing, some who may live in co-ops, and that we need to be open to different types of living arrangements, whether it's co-op, shared housing, and sort of working towards that, because it doesn't build integrated communities if you don't have the diversity of people who can sustain themselves in the city, whether they grew up there, whether they've arrived there, and they can sort of stay there throughout the different stages of their life. So I welcome the conversation today. I think it's been a really good one. It's important to highlight these issues, and I do appreciate all the panelists having a sort of a good and frank and open conversation. I hope that we can continue to have this type of dialogue, because we need the different points of view to come in. And we do have some realities. I think while we're striving towards it, it just sort of, for me, zeroes in on the fact that we need to put the majority of our focus and effort into different housing tenures and get it to the folks that need it. But we also can't ignore the development community, because as was mentioned by a number of folks, they have 80% of the land. So it's how do we work with them, and how do we have smart policy that enables that, whether it's things like covenants to guarantee the tenure, whether it's legislation to protect the tenure, it's financing tools, it's all of those pieces. So complex issue. Appreciate the conversation, and I appreciate everybody listening in, and thanks for the opportunity to have this forum. I think it's important. I'm looking forward to more dialogue.
Thank you very much, Councillor Kirby-Young. And yeah, please, I'm sure I am joined by all of our hundreds of participants in expressing so much gratitude to all 5 of our panelists and to Andy Yan. Andy, do you want to make your face shown again for just a little curtain call? The quality and just the quantity and the flow of questions and comments and diversity of ideas, I think is most striking in this conversation. If you are able to stick around, I do have 2 more poll questions that will be very helpful for the city and for us at SFU in understanding the public perspectives on housing. Here's the first one. Some neighborhoods have housing costs as we've seen and already discussed, that are out of reach or have few well, I'll just let you answer the question. You can read. And if we just make this a quick one, and I'll give you 5 more seconds to register your agreement or disagreement. And can we take a look at the answer, please, at the results? Okay. So that's some fairly strong feedback. And can we have the final question? The final poll is asking, most of our housing in Vancouver is developed by the private sector. What direction should the city be taking moving forward? And if we could just have about 5 more seconds to take a stand on this one. And could we see the results? Okay, so that's also some good feedback for the city. Thank you very much. Clearly a move towards reprioritizing housing for low and moderate income people, and shifting the focus, as well as balancing that with work with private industry. Thank you again. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to my SFU partners, SFU Public Square, the Van City Office of Community Engagement, City Program and Urban Studies. Thank you to the City of Vancouver. Learn more about the City of Vancouver's efforts in Vancouver Plan at vancouverplan.ca. Also, the City of Vancouver has a series of conversation kits. They're sort of like game boards that you can pick up physically or at community centers and the like. And you can also access digital copies in order to keep the conversation going. And there are prizes to be won for expressing your views and having conversations safely, of course, in the pandemic. We have other events coming up on other juicy topics that are equally core to thinking about the city's resilience and viability and equity and reconciliation in the coming 30 years. February 11th, we'll be talking about the challenge of completing neighborhoods. February 25th, we will be discussing economic health. March 4th, reimagining streets. And please do stay connected for other opportunities. I see the BC Nonprofit Housing Association also putting a link to more of their upcoming events and topics in the chat window. And I'll also say that SFU Urban Studies has an event with Public Square next week, another online event with another academic panel to talk about some of these issues of getting into the nuts and bolts of what makes our housing system work and how it can work better. We will be leaving those Padlet idea boards. I already see that I think they've been crashing some people's internet connections as we go. So that's one thing to consider, but it's a great repository of ideas. Thank you. They'll be open for another 30 minutes and you can leave the Zoom event and you can still have access to the Padlet. They're separate. Carrie, your final thoughts?
Oh, nothing. I thought it was really interesting. It could have gone on for 2 more hours, I think.
Yeah, easily. Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. I hope that you go out and party safely in the streets of Brussels, because you're up and it's the middle of the night anyway, Barbara. Thanks, everyone. Be well.
Thanks so much.
Bye, thanks.